Have you ever shared something deeply personal, um, hoping for connection, only to be met with judgment or even hostility? It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The idea that vulnerability could open the door to further pain.
Yeah, it's definitely a risk we take when we choose to share our stories, especially when those stories involve trauma or tragedy. And it's a risk that Amy B. Chesler, a writer and advocate we're diving into today, knows all too well.
Right. Amy's story, as many of you may know, was featured on the true crime podcast, Something Was Wrong. It's a harrowing account of her family's tragedy, the murder of her mother by her brother, and the years of abuse she endured.
Yeah, and while Amy initially found solace and support in sharing her experiences, the aftermath took a dark and unexpected turn. Her journey reveals a side of true crime that we don't often hear about, the complex and often devastating consequences that survivors can face when they step into the public eye.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We know Amy's story centers around a horrific event, the murder of her mother, Hadas, by her brother back in 2007. What's really unsettling is that this date, September 25th, also happens to be National Murder Victims Remembrance Day in America.
It's a chilling coincidence, isn't it? And one that Amy only discovered years later, adding another layer of weight to an already unimaginable tragedy.
Yeah, that really makes you think about the ripple effects of trauma, how it can continue to impact survivors long after the initial event.
Exactly. And in Amy's case, this trauma was compounded by years of abuse she and her mother suffered at the hands of her brother. But what's important to note here is that Amy's initial experience sharing her story through the podcast and her memoir was overwhelmingly positive.
You're right. It's actually pretty heartwarming to hear about the unexpected sources of support she received. I mean, even her ninth grade English teacher reached out with a touching book review. And her uncle, her father's brother, contacted her expressing gratitude for her honesty about their family's past.
It seems like sharing her story allowed Amy to connect with people on a deeper level, to find understanding and validation in unexpected places.
But as we know, this sense of peace was tragically short-lived. A parole hearing was scheduled for Amy's brother just as her story was gaining traction, and that's when things took a really dark turn.
Right. This hearing became a terrifying ordeal for Amy. Her brother made chilling threats during the proceedings, even referencing her address and threatening her family.
It's just bone-chilling. And to make matters worse, he postponed the hearing for 2 years, leaving Amy in a state of agonizing limbo, knowing he could potentially be released and knowing he knew where she lived.
Imagine the emotional toll of that, not only reliving your trauma publicly, but then facing concrete threats from the person who inflicted that trauma. It's a level of fear and uncertainty that's hard to fathom.
Absolutely. And if that wasn't enough, the responses Amy received after appearing on the TV show Evil Lives Here were all over the map.
Right. It was a real mixed bag. While she received supportive messages that validated her purpose in sharing her story, she was also bombarded with cruel and insensitive comments.
What kind of comments are we talking about here?
Some viewers fixated on her appearance, making hurtful remarks. Others made unfounded accusations about drug use. She even received death threats. It's a stark reminder that the true crime genre can attract a certain segment of the audience who seem to lose sight of the human cost of these stories.
It's almost like they view survivors as characters in a macabre form of entertainment rather than real people grappling with unimaginable pain.
Precisely. And in Amy's case, it went even further. Someone began catfishing others using her identity, preying on people's sympathy for her story to deceive and potentially exploit them.
Wow. So not only was she dealing with the trauma of her past and the threats from her brother, but she also had to contend with someone stealing her identity and potentially harming others in her name.
It's a truly disturbing situation. And to add insult to injury, social media platforms refused to verify her account, leaving her even more susceptible to this kind of exploitation.
It seems like a vicious cycle. Trying to reclaim your narrative and find strength in sharing your story only to be met with further victimization and a lack of support from the very platforms that could offer protection.
It's a complex issue, and it highlights the challenges survivors face in navigating the digital world, especially when their stories become entangled with the true crime genre.
Now, what I found really interesting is Amy's observation about the interconnectedness of media and the justice system. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Of course, Amy noticed that media attention seemed to spur action in her brother's case. It was almost as if the public spotlight forced the system to take notice and act on the threats he had made.
So in a way, the media attention that she both welcomed and dreaded ended up working in her favor. It's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It certainly is, but it highlights a complex reality. Sometimes the path to justice is intertwined with the very forces that can cause pain and re-traumatization.
That's a really thought-provoking point, and it makes me think about how true crime is often presented. Amy also observed a troubling trend, the tendency for true crime productions to offer a sanitized or incomplete perspective.
Yes, that's a crucial point. She noticed that these productions often gloss over the nuances of survivor experiences, focusing more on the sensationalism of the crime itself, rather than the long-term impact on those left behind. It's like the focus is on the crime as a spectacle, rather than the human beings who are forever changed by it.
And that brings us to What Came Next, the podcast Amy created. It seems like this realization, this awareness of the missing pieces in the typical true crime narrative, was a major driving force behind her decision to start the podcast.
You're absolutely right. Amy wanted to provide a platform for survivors to share their full journey, including the often unseen struggles they face long after the cameras stop rolling. She wanted to shift the focus from the crime itself to the ripple effects on those involved, giving survivors the agency to shape their own narratives.
It's a powerful concept, giving a voice to those who are often silenced or misrepresented in the dominant true crime narratives. And I think it speaks to a growing awareness of the need for more nuanced and empathetic portrayals of survivors' experiences.
Absolutely. And through this platform, Amy aims to raise awareness about the realities of life after trauma and potentially spark societal change. She believes in the power of shared stories to create understanding, foster empathy, and ultimately move us toward a more just and compassionate world.
So let's delve into the heart of what came next. What kinds of stories does Amy feature on her podcast, and what are some of the common threads that connect these diverse voices?
One of the things that's so compelling about What Came Next is the sheer range of stories Amy features. It's not just focused on one type of crime or one type of survivor experience. We hear from people who've navigated a wide variety of traumas, each with their own unique challenges and triumphs.
Right. It's like a tapestry of resilience woven together from these diverse threads of human experience. For example, we have Elisa Wall, who was featured in the documentary Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. She speaks about the challenges of adapting to life outside the confines of the FLDS Church after escaping from years of control and abuse.
Her story sheds light on the lasting psychological impact of cults, how they can warp an individual's sense of self and the world around them. Leaving a cult isn't just about physical escape. It's about untangling years of indoctrination and rebuilding your life from the ground up.
It's like escaping from a mental prison and then having to relearn how to navigate the world with a newfound sense of freedom, but also vulnerability.
Exactly. And then we have Jacob Ballard, whose story was at the center of the Netflix documentary Our Father. He talks about the profound sense of violation he felt upon discovering that his biological father, a fertility doctor, had secretly fathered dozens of children through artificial insemination without their mother's knowledge or consent.
That case is just mind-boggling. It raises so many questions about medical ethics, consent, and the very definition of family. I can't even imagine the emotional turmoil of discovering something like that about your own origins.
It's a betrayal on such a fundamental level, shaking the very foundation of identity and belonging. And for Jacob, it's also about reclaiming his agency and finding peace in the face of this deeply unsettling truth. He's actively working to change laws and hold his biological father accountable.
It's inspiring to see how he's channeling his pain into a force for positive change. It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of finding purpose in the face of adversity.
And speaking of facing adversity, we also hear from John Schnackenberg, who found himself caught in the crosshairs of the Fyre Festival scandal, as detailed in the Netflix documentary, Fyre. Now, he wasn't a victim in the traditional sense, but his story offers a unique perspective on the moral dilemmas people can face when they're even tangentially involved in a situation that causes harm to others.
Right. He talks about wrestling with the pressure to profit from the Fyre Festival, despite knowing that the whole thing was a sham and that people were being exploited.
It's a reminder that even those who aren't direct victims can be impacted by these events, forced to grapple with their own complicity and the ethical choices they make in the aftermath. His story adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of true crime, moving beyond clear-cut categories of victims and perpetrators.
Absolutely. And then we have Colleen Landry, whose story was told in the documentary A Murder in Mansfield. Her father murdered her mother when she was a child, and she speaks about her lifelong quest to understand his motivations, a search for answers that has fueled her advocacy work for children of incarcerated parents.
Colleen's story highlights the profound impact of trauma on children and how that trauma can shape an individual's trajectory throughout their life. It also speaks to the importance of finding meaning and purpose in the face of tragedy.
It's like she's taken this horrific experience and turned it into a force for good, using her pain to advocate for others who've experienced similar trauma.
And then there's Tara Newell, whose harrowing encounter with Dirty John Meehan was chronicled in the eponymous podcast and television series. She speaks powerfully about the disbelief and victim blaming she faced, particularly from those who couldn't comprehend how she could have fallen prey to Meehan's manipulation.
Her story really sheds light on the insidious nature of coercive control, how abusers can manipulate and exploit their victims in subtle ways that are often invisible to outsiders.
Exactly. Tara's experience underscores the importance of understanding the dynamics of abuse, recognizing the red flags, and challenging the societal tendency to blame victims rather than holding abusers accountable.
We often hear these stories and think, that would never happen to me. But Tara's case demonstrates that these predators can target anyone, regardless of their intelligence, social status, or awareness.
It's a sobering reminder that we all need to be vigilant and educated about the tactics abusers use to gain control and manipulate their victims.
And What Came Next also features survivors who faced unimaginable scrutiny and exploitation in the public eye. We hear from PJ Maston, who speaks about the re-traumatizing experience of watching his story unfold in Secrets of Playboy, where he was portrayed as a victim of sexual abuse within the Playboy Mansion.
His story highlights the complex ethical considerations surrounding documentary filmmaking, particularly when it involves vulnerable individuals who may be re-traumatized by the process of having their experiences dissected and scrutinized for public consumption.
It's a reminder that even with the best of intentions, the act of sharing one's story publicly can carry unforeseen consequences, especially when that story involved trauma and exploitation.
And we also hear from Charlotte Laws, who fought tirelessly to bring down Hunter Moore, the mastermind behind the notorious revenge porn website Is Anyone Up?, a battle she details in The Most Hated Man on the Internet.
Her story is incredibly powerful. It speaks to the courage and tenacity it takes to stand up to online abusers and fight for justice in a system that's often ill-equipped to deal with these new forms of exploitation.
Charlotte's advocacy work was instrumental in bringing about legislation to criminalize revenge porn, demonstrating the power of one person to make a tangible difference in the fight against online abuse. It's a testament to the potential for positive change, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
What all these stories seem to have in common is this struggle for agency, this fight to reclaim one's narrative and find healing and empowerment in the aftermath of trauma.
You've hit on a crucial point. What Came Next is about shifting the focus from the crime itself to the ongoing journey of the survivors, recognizing that their stories don't end when the headlines fade away. It's about giving them the space to share their experiences on their own terms, to challenge the dominant narratives, and to advocate for themselves and others who've been through similar experiences.
It's remarkable how these survivors manage to find strength and purpose even after enduring such horrific experiences. It's like they're taking back control, using their voices and their experiences to create something positive out of something so painful.
That's the heart of what makes What Came Next so inspiring. It's not just about recounting trauma, it's about showcasing the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of finding one's voice.
And speaking of transformative power, I was really struck by Koa Johnson's story. He was featured in The Housewife and The Shaw Shocker, and he talks about finding peace and continuing his healing journey even after the perpetrator, Jen Shah, pleaded guilty to the charges against her.
His story is a powerful testament to the fact that healing is an individual journey. It's not dependent on external validation or the legal outcomes of a case. Koa chose to focus on his own well-being and reclaim his power regardless of the perpetrator's actions.
It's like he refused to let her define his healing journey. He found a way to separate himself from her actions and focus on his own growth. It's incredibly inspiring.
And we see this spirit of empowerment in many of Amy's guests. They're not just passively accepting their circumstances, they're actively working to change the narrative, to advocate for themselves and others, and to make a difference in the world.
Take Charlotte Laws, for example. Her tireless fight to bring down Hunter Moore and criminalize revenge porn demonstrates that individuals can spark real change even in the face of systemic challenges.
Absolutely. Her story shows us that we don't have to be bystanders in the face of injustice. We can use our voices, our resources, and our platforms to advocate for change, to support survivors, and to hold perpetrators accountable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Amy B. Chesler's journey and her podcast, What Came Next, I'm left with this feeling of hope. Yes, there's darkness and pain in these stories, but there's also this incredible light that shines through. The light of resilience, courage, and the determination to create a better world.
You've captured the essence of what Amy is trying to achieve with her work. It's about moving beyond the sensationalism of true crime and focusing on the human stories at its core. It's about acknowledging the long road to healing that survivors face and supporting them in their journeys.
And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate world, whether it's through educating ourselves about the dynamics of abuse, supporting organizations that help survivors, or simply being more mindful of how we consume true crime content. We can all make a difference.
Ultimately, what came next is a call to action. It's an invitation to engage with these stories not just as passive consumers, but as active participants in a movement toward greater understanding, empathy, and support for survivors of trauma.
And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about these issues and hear these powerful stories firsthand, we encourage you to check out Amy B. Chesler's podcast, What Came Next. It's a deeply moving and thought-provoking experience that will stay with you long after you finish listening.